COP26 STEAM for ACE webinars, and that's a lot of acronyms. So it's supported by the Durham Energy Institute. As you can see, Lynn Gibson there is supporting us. And the acronyms stand for, hopefully you've heard of COP26. It's been in the news so much. Boris Johnson's just been talking about it at his party conference. And it's the climate change conference that's going to be in Glasgow in the first 2 weeks of November. And all eyes are on the UK and all hopes are pinned on this conference. The ACE stands for Action for Climate Emergency. And the STEAM stands for Sciences, Physical and Social, Technology, Engineering, Arts and Maths. And it is all of the disciplines that we need to address global challenges such as climate change. So this month, the rundown to COP26 Durham University webinars are all around nature and nature-based solutions, which is one of the 5 themes of COP26 this year. So we make no apologies for the fact that these nature-based solutions and nature webinars are all about soil, because soil is the Cinderella of resources. It is not very glamorous, but it does underpin all of life. And the UN have said that soil health, healthy soils are absolutely essential if we're to address all 17 of their sustainable development goals, not just climate change, which of course is what we're focusing on today. So the format of this webinar today is a little bit different to previous rundown to COP26 webinars that Durham has hosted, because there are no slides. So it's just our faces that you'll see. And it's basically a conversation. So we're going to spend, the panelists, who you can see their faces. If you're not a panelist, you might want to switch your camera off, because we might interject and ask your opinion. You're going to hear from us talking about a nation that rebuilds its soil, rebuilds itself, and questioning each other about this agenda. That's just for the first 30 minutes, though. The next 20 minutes is talking to you guys and getting questions in. So at that stage, I will be looking to the chat function. Please, everybody put their chat function on so you can see what questions are coming in and think about your own questions. The purpose of these 4 webinars is to raise awareness, to get us to think more with the audience about soil health and climate change. So when we get to that stage, I'll ask you, or you can put in the chat with your question, whether you want to ask the question. You can just say, I've got a question, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and come to you. So that'll be at about 1:30. You can also put your camera on. These are all recorded, these webinars, and you can see the recordings online. If you just Google Durham STEAM for ACE, and then you will find all of the previous webinars that we've run since April this year. So don't put your camera on if you don't want to be on screen, but do put your microphone on if you want to ask the question in person, but do feel empowered to ask a question just in the chat function as well. So I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to go around the circle of panelists who you can see online now and ask them to introduce themselves. So I'm Karen Johnson. I'm an environmental engineer working in the Department of Engineering at Durham University, and I'm passionate about soil. And my research is all about digging stuff into soil. It's digging minerals, redox active minerals like iron and manganese oxides into soil at the same time as organic matter. And the reason I want to do that is to look at climate change mitigation, that is storing carbon in the soil by rebuilding soil structure, but also importantly, climate change adaptation. So storing water in the soil is another function that soil carries out for us, which of course, anyone who's from where I'm from, the northeast of England, that's where I'm sat at the minute, will have seen the news about flooding yesterday. It's a massive global north issue. But the colleagues that I'm working with that are on the panel today are from across the world, and I'm sure they will tell you a bit about a global south perspective and the fact that we need to look at soil health in order to enhance drought resilience as well as flood resilience. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to next in the circle to introduce themselves, which is Professor Neal Gray.
I'll unmute myself. Hi, my name's Neal Gray. I'm Professor in Geomicrobiology at Newcastle University, and I realised I've been there 27 years. I'm a chemist by background, but now I work in this field of geomicrobiology. What does it mean? Well, from my perspective, it's the sort of, my interests are in mineral, microbe, organic matter interactions in natural and engineered settings. And I'm also interested, which is where Karen has sort of drawn me into this, I'm also interested in waste, or should I say resource treatment and reuse. I'm not an agronomist or a traditional soil scientist, but I am fascinated by soils because they, I guess, are the epitome of mineral, microbe, organic matter interactions, with plants thrown in as well, of course. And they can be both natural and engineered. So I use molecular microbial techniques to couple to analytical chemical approaches to try to mechanistically understand. And I think, you know, with Karen's engineering hat on, she wants to engineer soils to make them better. And I think understanding what happens to the microbes in those systems could be very fascinating in both explaining and predicting what might happen. Okay.
Unmute myself. So next, Steve, can you introduce yourself? Dr. Steve Chibasa.
Okay, I'm Steve Chibasa. I am in the biosciences department at Durham, and I'm a plant biologist. And my interest in the soil basically is coming from the soil is the substratum where plants grow in the field in agriculture. And my special interest in my research, I want to see how plants respond to stress and particularly drought stress. So there are some very interesting things that over the past few years have come up, which show how things in the soil dictate what happens to the plant when it's responding to things like drought. So that's my kind of interest in this. And with colleagues here as well, I'm now getting interested to kind of go further afield to look at how the plants kind of talk to microorganisms that are actually based in the soil. So that's my kind of research area.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. And Wendy, Dr. Wendy Stone, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, my name is Wendy Stone. I work at Stellenbosch University. I work in close collaboration with Dr. Cathy Clarke, who is also meant to be here today. So I'm a microbiologist that works at the Water Institute. So we look at sort of everything on the water end of science. And Cathy looks at the soils. And so we've paired together to land apply a lot of wastes, like water treatment residuals, which is the sludges coming out of clean water treatment plants, as well as sewage sludges, and looking at beneficiation for applying to some, Karen mentioned we're in the global south, and our problem is very nutrient poor soils. We're struggling with drought, so water holding capacity. And so what we do is try to find ways to utilize waste to enrich the soils. And I am, as a microbiologist, I think it might pop up in the conversation today or in one of the future sessions, is really looking at this notion of soil as living. I'm very interested in the notion of relationship. So where is science facilitating relationship, and where is science breaking relationship, or at least the communication of science breaking relationship with our natural resources? And so I'm interested in government connection, so societal connection, and then the sense of care for the soil. So
thanks, Wendy. That's great. And Torreira, you're next. Dr. Torreira Guando, Neely.
Okay, thank you. My name is Torreira Guando, and I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm an expert in soil and environmental management, and I'm currently studying for a PhD towards environmental engineering with Durham University. I'm basically interested in rebuilding soils, in particular soil health, because I believe it underpins all the processes which are necessary for soils to provide their ecosystem functions. I'm currently working on soil health improvement technologies to enhance drought and nutrient resilience in urban agroecosystems in the wake of climate change. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Torreira. So we also have, which confused me at first, Professor Lina Damanelli, who is not on the panel today, but she is going to be joining us for one of the webinars in our series at the end of the month. So I'll give a shout out for them at the end of today's session, but I'm looking forward to your questions, Lina. So I'm going to kick off with a question of, why do we want to rebuild soils for climate change mitigation or adaptation? Who wants to start the conversation rolling?
I think I can start.
Thanks, Torreira.
Yeah, okay. Globally, it shows that 25% of soils are degraded. And in the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, about 2/3 of the soils are degraded. And zooming in on Zimbabwe, you find that 70% of our agricultural soils are severely degraded, mainly because farmers do not use soil nutrient resources, that is both the mineral and the organic fertilizers, which has basically rendered the soils empty. And as such, you find that crop production has severely declined. The soils are now more prone to soil erosion and drought. And this has resulted in widespread poverty, especially among smallholder farmers. So I feel it is very important to rebuild degraded soils, especially in this part of the world, so that we can restore the soil's capacity to produce food and also to store carbon, especially in the wake of climate change. In my work, I'm trying to rebuild soils using water treatment residual, which is a byproduct of clean water treatment, to try and enhance nutrient and drought resilience in soils in urban agriculture. You find that at the national level in Zimbabwe, the government has also embarked on conservation agriculture. They are promoting conservation agriculture to try and build degraded soils and to improve food security, especially among the smallholder farmers. So I think it is very important to build degraded soils.
Torreira, that's great. Can I pick up on something you said there? Because I know when I first started working with you, I didn't know what conservation agriculture is. So some of our audience might know what that means, but they might not. Can you say what that is and how it's different to, for example, the sort of farming that is happening in most of our farms in the UK, where we're using a lot of chemicals and pesticides?
Yeah, okay, you find that the conventional system involves intensive tillage. In conservation agriculture, there's promotion of very minimal tillage, like less soil disturbance. And then also you have to maintain some form of soil cover to prevent soil erosion. Yeah, basically that's what conservation agriculture entails.
Okay, thank you very much, Torreira. Neal, I see that you've got a comment to make.
Oh, really, another question really to Torreira. So sorry about this, throwing questions at you. When we say degraded, what do we mean by degraded? Physically, what is happening to these soils?
Okay, you find that soil degradation comes in so many forms, from physical, chemical, and biological. The physical forms are the ones that we can see, like when you look at a soil. For example, you can see gullies where there's erosion. When the soil is washed away, there's formation of gullies. And then the soil is washed away into rivers and water bodies. And then the chemical degradation is whereby the soil nutrient levels go down to such levels that you find that the soils are no longer productive for plant production. And the biological form of degradation is whereby the soil biodiversity, like the microorganisms in the soil, they go down, and also there is no soil organic matter in the soils. You find that the soils are like empty, they're like a skeleton.
Yeah.
Okay, and so soil organic matter is a critical component of that degradation process.
True. Yeah. It's also at the center of soil health, soil organic matter. Yeah.
And I think that's what we're not teaching people and raising awareness of. I think, you know, we all of us have discussed this before. It's that soil organic matter, which is the link with climate change, because it's made of carbon. And when we degrade soils, either through water erosion or wind erosion, through intensive agriculture, we are releasing that carbon into the atmosphere to contribute to climate change in many cases. Sure. Anyone else? Steve or Wendy, any comments to make?
And I can maybe jump in here, and I just almost want to, this seems like a beautiful point to quote, sort of one of my favorite points that you've made previously, Karen, is that notion, and I think it's Andy Neal that also, is it Andy Neal that wrote the paper on the notion of soil being living, and that soil organic matter, just looking at it as an ecosystem, the soil organic matter is what feeds, well, you'll see in microbiology, there's a lot of work out there trying to identify particular microorganisms, and I think you were the one who made the analogy of raising a child, that you kind of feed a living organism and it forms itself. So soil is living. It's got the potential, and it's the microbes, it's the sort of microorganisms, the macroorganisms, it's the plants that sort of create that structure, that root it, and that links to the physics, it links to the chemistry. So that idea of sort of providing the soil organic matter, and not just the soil organic matter, I think there's quite a lot of research that soil organic matter alone it needs to be coupled with the micronutrients. So it's basically like if you give a child just carbon, it's not going to survive. You need to give it a very broad and full diet, a diverse diet, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, is this idea of what do we need to understand of the soil full biome, the ecology of the soil, and how do we feed the soil, and then that will be quite diverse between, say, the global north, the global south, or even different areas near one another here. But
and that's I love this analogy, as you know, because it's very intuitive to me, being the mother of 3 kids. You know, I go to bed happy when they've been fed and they've eaten all their dinner and it's had a good range of vegetables and, you know, and protein and carbohydrates, etc. And there's different sorts of malnutrition. We know from the World Health Organization, there's the not getting enough food, and then there's the micronutrient deficiency. And soil is the same. It's at the base of our health. And of course, this is where the plants come in with Steve's expertise. You know, the plants are feeding the carbon into the soil, and the microbes can fix the nitrogen, but the micronutrients, we're dependent on that microbiome and to access them from the minerals in the soil. And release them to the plants that we then eat, and you know, are the foundation of our health. So yeah. Any more comments on Neal? I see you've got your hand up.
I just muted myself rather than unmute myself. Obviously the mineral component of soil is important, and we've talked about the idea of adding minerals to soils, and I think there's a growing awareness that not only are minerals the sources of nutrients, but they're also the sources of the stabilization of the organic carbon in its own right. So the interactions of the mineral component, and that can vary obviously across soils, will dictate the ability for that soil to retain the organic matter. So hence your ideas about putting these things into soil and actually changing soils, engineering soils to give the maximum potential for that soil organic matter to be retained in the system. I'm not the expert on that, but I think that's the way we're thinking on this, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where the engineers can come in and work with the soil scientists and the social scientists and, you know, the artists and the humanities peoples as well, because we need to capture people's hearts in this matter, change the way we engage with soil. But ultimately, we need to look at feeding the soil and treating it like the living system that it is. And this is where we get into semantics, but it's useful to have the narrative of soil health and human health being one and the same in some ways. You know, when we look at Torreira, I know that you know more about the micronutrient deficiencies like zinc that are prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, and you too, Wendy. If we're not providing the plants with those micronutrients, then we don't get those micronutrients in our diets. And where engineers come in, I think we don't have the knowledge of soil that the soil scientists do, the farmers do, But where engineers come in, I think, is that we can look to optimize waste materials to add them to the soil to perform a function. That's what engineers do. They like to solve a problem. And of course, then we can work with the social scientists in order to engage communities and understand what their problems are. Is it zinc that's missing from their diet? Is it the fact that they can't hold enough water in the soil in order to get a sufficient yield? What is the problem with the soil? And then we can look to tackle it on a site-specific, community-specific basis, of course. And it's interesting to note that this is not rocket science. You know, farmers 2 generations ago would have been doing this naturally, intuitively, understanding that they have to have diverse cropping, lots of different plants instead of monocultures. And they would have to feed the soil, maybe add a particle like sand or clay that the soil didn't have if they had access to it in order to change the drainage, change the oxygen levels, etc. And we've moved away from that with intensive agriculture, conventional agriculture, as Torreira says. Any other points to bring in on that rebuilding agenda?
I would like to bring a different perspective coming from the crops. So the classical kind of opinion has been that crop genetics, if you look at different crops, the genes within that crop, they are the ones that dictate the yield potential for farmers. But of late, data has been coming out, which is actually showing that the cooperation between soil microorganisms and plant roots is so important that the behavior of a plant in soil, it changes. So for example, some of the experiments we are doing, we are exposing plants which we get from Southern Africa to drought or optimal watering conditions. But the behavior changes dependent upon the diversity of microorganisms that are found in that soil. And the microorganisms, their diversity is actually dictated to by the physical parameters like the soil organic matter and other things. So all these things are so intertwined that most plant biologists are now moving away from just having a plant-centric view, but to look at it as a kind of a connected system where you look at the soil properties and the resident microbiome, and how that interaction affects the plant performance in terms of its agricultural potential.
That's so exciting to hear, because our expertise in drilling down and understanding things at the genomic level, of course, has just transformed and is going to continue to transform biology and medicine for the coming years. And it's really exciting, but it's also sort of, the flip side of that coin is we've become so siloed within science that, this expertise requires so much knowledge just to understand a small part of a plant system, for example, that it's really refreshing to hear that we're becoming a little bit more sort of holistic, and also realizing the connected nature. And of course, we have been for a couple of decades now, realizing the connected nature of ecosystems, and that you can't study things in isolation. We need the reductionist approach to try and get some statistically significant results, but we also need to study the natural system in order to try and see the emergent properties which come out. And the drought resistance genes, it's so exciting. There was a program on telly, actually. It was, I think it's on BBC4, Water, the Molecule That Makes Life, I think it's called. And there was a prof from Cape University, Cape Town University, I think, Wendy, who was talking about looking at the drought resistance genes in some of the everlasting flower species that live in the Cape and in the Namakwa land, and looking at that, if you could put that gene into other plants from those indigenous crops, then that is part of the solution potentially for giving that drought resistance to crops that wouldn't traditionally be grown in that soil. So, yeah. I see that there's a question come in. Sorry, Wendy, did you want to talk? I'll just read these questions from Lena and then.
Yeah, I thought I would just sort of hop in with one thought on that. So we're talking a little bit about the genetic potential, and I think one of my favorite points with the microbiology of the soil is that we've also spoken about this. It's the Barsbecking has said that everything is everywhere, but the environment selects. And there's something beautiful about the buffered nature of the microbiology. So plants exchange genes quite slowly. But if you look at soil health, if you add soil organic matter and enough micronutrients, you've basically got the genetic potential for anything that'll exchange very quickly. And to me, that gives a lot of hope within this climate change concept, which feels quite hopeless regularly, that if we put the soil organic matter in there, the microbes have the potential to do what they need to do.
I like the Field of Dreams film with the strapline of "If you build it, they will come." And, yeah. I always feel that way with microbes, that they given the right opportunities, they will do a lot of the hard graft for you.
Yeah, that's just it in a nutshell, isn't it? And I know that's what Andy's paper was about. Was they did some modeling to understand the structure of soil, and they looked at the Rothamsted Institute soils, where they've had trials going on for 150 years, which have been growing wheat, for example, with chemical fertilizer addition. And they can see that some of those soils where they've used too much chemical fertilizer and too much pesticide are very degraded, and other soils that have had more natural regenerative agricultural practices. And they modeled the soil structure, and they saw that the soil structure was very poor in the soils that had been intensively farmed, as we've been suggesting. And in the more natural, where soil circular economy, where it had all the carbon and nutrients that it needed, both macro like nitrogen and phosphorus, but also the micronutrients, had a really good soil structure. And what was exciting was they showed that soil structure was dependent on the living microbiome. Hence this analogy with human health, and soil is living like human beings are living, because soil without that life is just a pile of minerals and a bit of organic molecules. If the microbiome, the living parts, a microbiome means the microbes, the archaea, the fungi, if they haven't got the right food source, then they start to die off. And you need a selection of them, as Wendy's saying, in order to actually build that soil structure. And what was exciting, though, the hope again out of Andy's paper from Rothamsted, was the fact that there was a critical point where soil was sort of pretty much dead, but not completely dead, and then alive. And when you got to that critical point, it didn't take much at all to bring it back to life, with a bit of inputs from the plants of carbon and nitrogen and a few micronutrients. So there is a lot of hope. It's just changing practices, changing how we do things.
Yeah, I would add finally just a quick one, if I may, that there's actually an emerging view that whilst we are farming crops, crops are farming microbes. And the successful crops like sorghum, which is phenomenally drought resilient, it has a capability to restructure the microbiome around its roots, and it owes its survival to these extreme harsh conditions, to the type of microbiome that it is farming within its rhizosphere or root area.
That's really exciting. And I've read other literature talking about, the microbiome being in control and farming us or whatever, and, you can go quite far out there with some of the theories, but I love that, Steve. And it makes a lot of sense, that the mycorrhizal relationships with the symbiotic, the mycorrhizal fungi going into the roots, and that symbiotic relationship. But the idea that plants are organizing the right microbiome, exuding the right chemicals to attract the right microbiome so that they get what they need. It has a lot of analogies again with human society, doesn't it? I'm going to look to Lena's question. Lena, did you want to put your microphone on and actually ask them yourself? It would be great, because we're at past and it'd be great to start engaging the audience. Please shout out.
Okay, well, I have two. I'll go to the second one because it follows more naturally from what Stephen was saying. And the question is very much about, I understand how we need to build healthy soils, but it seems to me that a lot of what is being said is about transforming agricultural practices, particularly the ones that are dominated by agribusiness. And somebody mentioned smallholder farmers earlier on. But I wondered, because I know that Stephen, you and Karen and others have done some work on implementing this on the ground. If you could talk to us about some of that, because I think it's really exciting to hear that this is not just about research, but it's actually about putting research into practice. And how in small areas you were able to, I remember some of the pictures you showed when I was at Durham of great big huge tall plants compared to little tiny plants and things like that. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. That's a great question. I'll kick off with that one and then hand over to Torreira and to Steve and Wendy and Neal to say as well. So yes, we have got field trials on the ground. That's Torreira. I'll let Torreira talk about that. That's in Zimbabwe. And Wendy has also been the lead author on papers where we've looked at using these materials that we're saying help rebuild soils, that we can add to soil, so minerals and organic matter. Where I think it's links into what you're talking about on the ground, how does it work, is we've got the scientific results to show that the plants are bigger, the yields are stronger, there's more zinc in the plants. So we're addressing some of the micronutrient concerns when we use both minerals like iron oxides and organic matter to help rebuild soil structure. The on the ground bit is the difficult bit. That's where your expertise comes in, is that, and I'll let Torreira talk in more detail about this, but actually getting people to want to change. When we have had 2 generations of farmers and education teaching us the way to grow crops. And of course, we fed billions of people with the Green Revolution from the 50s and 60s. I'm not dissing it. It worked for a short time, but we were completely blindsided. Apart from Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, we were blindsided about the fact that it completely trashed the soil. We were growing food at the expense of soil, and we have damaged soil around the world. 1/3 of all soil is degraded, 1/3 of all the cultivated land. So it's winning hearts and minds, and that's the sort of negative point of view, is that we know how to do this. Many governments are encouraging conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, whatever we want to call it, working with the environment rather than using far too much chemicals to grow our crops. But it's at a local, regional scale. It's not at a national, or certainly not at a global scale. And it's that, how do we get across that, is to do with communities and engaging them. And I know, Torreira, you've done some work in Zimbabwe with the farmer learning centers, and actually listening to farmers and hearing about what's important to them. Did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Maybe I'll talk about the Farmer Learning Center first. This one was promoted by the Soil Fertility Consortium for Southern Africa in collaboration with the University of Zimbabwe. And farmers were at the center of interventions which were aimed at improving soil fertility of their soils. You find that improved crop yields and nutrient availability were documented by the researchers who were working in that initiative. So yeah, we can improve, we can rebuild our soils through various interventions. And also at the moment, we are working with water treatment residual, which is both organomineral, and we have used it together with the organic nutrient resources. And we found that we got improved crop yields and also micronutrients, copper and zinc. They were higher in the fields where we used the WTR in conjunction with organic matter compared to the controls where we did not use anything. So we can rebuild soils using organics and mineral fertilizers.
Thanks, Torreira. Lena, I don't know if you want to come back on that one. It's an excellent question, and this is what we're grappling with, is on the ground, how do we make it work? And obviously Torreira's making progress in that area, and we need to learn from the Farmer Learning Centre model.
I think we do, and I think we have to start putting communities at the center of the changes that we want. And there's a lot of work as I'm sure Torreira knows, to try and convince people to change their ways of thinking, especially as they had a lot of inputs and incentives. So we do have to think about how do we incentivize people, but also I think, and you and I have spoken about this in the past, Karen, how do we also get the next generation to start thinking differently? Because they're very concerned about their environment. So how do we engage with them? And your wonderful terrarium is an example of that.
I brought one along. So we're really excited. We've me and Lena and some others have got a bit of exhibition space at COP26 on the 5th of November, Youth Day, to work with young people to get their hands dirty and build these. They're very fashionable at the moment, terrariums, but basically it's a jam jar full of soil. There's a bit of gravel at the bottom for drainage so it doesn't all go moldy. Then whatever soil material you want to put in and a plant. And it's just early days, but we're quite excited about the potential of this. We're working with Wendy and Steve and all the guys here on this because kids love it, but farmers love it as well. I've met some real soulmates, farmers who've also got terrariums on the go with their own soil, and they're adding stuff, seeing what works. Because it's quite scientific really at the end of the day, because it's a sealed system, so it's energetically open, so the sun can get in and help the plants to grow. But you can count the carbon atoms here. You can look at the water cycle. It's a great paper from Nature Climate Change from 2010, which has been cited about 10 times by Milku et al. And you know, it's really an untapped potential for studying more of the ecosystem of soil from less of a reductionist approach.
And I think it also highlights the importance of getting children at school. Because if we started getting the younger generation to do this as an automatic part of their geography class at the right ages, like especially the kind of like 6 to 8 year olds, they'd be really, really keen to do this, judging from what happened to my child when he was that age and he mucked about in the garden at school all the time. And I think we have to have a many-pronged strategy to deal with the different levels of changes, because we have to change thinking among farmers, amongst policymakers, amongst salespeople who go out to sell pesticides, herbicides, and all the other things that are undermining our soil. But as you said, you know, it's really important we don't diss the scientific innovations of the past, because they did get us over a hump. But we're finding that, and I was one of those lucky undergraduates who studied Silent Springs a long, long time ago amongst the study, because I had a tutor at university who said, you got to read this, Lena, you'll love it. And I did, because I imagine it set your path. Right, that's great. Just a shout out to the final webinar on the 28th, I think it is 27th, Wednesday, the 27th of October, is all about building terrariums, and there'll be school kids on the call. We haven't got them lined up yet, but we're hoping. So we've got a question. I know you've got another question, Lena, but Fiona's got a question. Fiona, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I said I was happy for you to ask, but
sorry.
Never mind.
Sorry. Misread that. I need my glasses on.
It's just going from micro to macro level a bit. My question is, the demand to meet deadlines for export must have an impact on how farmers treat their soils. Would more locally sourced food take the pressure off local farmers to optimize and mass produce crops for overseas consumption, mainly in developed countries? So I'm always interested in this overconsumption angle of climate change. So any ideas on that?
Such a big question, and
it is. It's political and complex, I know, but
absolutely. But you're so right to ask it. The whole agri-food system needs a shake up, and of course that's what the Food and Agriculture, the UN's FAO, are looking at. But how to do it in this globalized world is really difficult. What I think we do know, in the shift from more conventional intensive agriculture, where we've set up this system of monocultures, often growing crops like wheat and maize that are not suitable in countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa, not suitable for that climate necessarily. We need support, we need government initiatives that would align with net zero initiatives, would align with biodiversity initiatives, but we need that funding and support from big business as well as from government to change, make that transition from intensive commercial agriculture. And surely, you know, locally produced crops in urban agriculture are part of that solution as well. I don't know if you want to come back, Fiona, and say something about that. It's not a topic I know a huge amount about at all.
No, I'm not an expert in this area, but sort of degrowth and overconsumption is surely part of us trying to mitigate climate change. So I'm just interested to hear if anybody else has any views. But yes, you've summed things up really.
Stephen, you
right? Okay, so I think when you look at it from the perspective of the developed countries, the issue becomes very, very, very complex. And I can say this safely because I come from sub-Saharan Africa myself. But what you have is within the kind of rich, prosperous Western countries, the climate there has a limited range of crops that it can sustain. And so because of the wealth that is here, there are certain things, certain types of fruits that you can only grow in hotter climates that wouldn't grow here. To actually persuade the population and say, we have to do without ABC, I think that becomes almost impossible. Unless, well, I don't know what would be the conditions that could happen. But I think it's more complex. It's now more about the consumer choices and what money can buy from anywhere in the world. But also from an economic standpoint, for the developing countries, the exports are actually a lifeline for these smallholder, poorer farmers. So I think maybe what we need is a much more balanced way of trade and control and exports that doesn't neglect the soil aspect within the equation. But to do away with it completely, I think it might not work in my view, but I'm not an economist.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to come in on that topic? I see there's a, Lena, you've made a point. I think, I remember watching a program about Brexit before Brexit by Ed Balls. I think he made it in an attempt to, you know, sway opinion, but it was quite cleverly done. He was talking about how trade would change after Brexit and looking at the shipping containers moving around the world. But the point that came across to me was nothing to do with Brexit. I learned watching that program that we produce very, very big apples in the UK. We're very good at making apples. And we don't like to eat big apples. And I thought about myself and I thought, yeah, I like to take a small apple, to be honest. And I'm a typical British person. We ship the big apples in crates, which have the lovely London skyline on them and the Union Jack flag, to the United Arab Emirates and all around the world. And then we take in apples that are small from other countries. And it's just that sort of is in a nutshell, isn't it? Our globalized system that doesn't take into account the environment and the effect on the environment of that trade. And so until we get a system where the agri-food system takes into account the carbon emissions, and not just the carbon emissions, the footprint, water footprint, etc., of our food, then we're not going to be able to achieve net zero, I think. And a local produce, as Lena says, is got to be part of that. But we've also got to tackle that very thorny bush, as you say, Steve, of none of us are very keen to change our lifestyles, meaning us in general, including myself, though. It's that, you know, we need political change, but we also need as individuals to step up and start eating less meat and, you know, driving less often in a diesel car, for example. So, yeah, just looking at the questions here. Any more questions coming out of that? Any more points people want to make? Yeah, your own garden, Lena.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Karen, vis-a-vis Ed Balls, the reason why you get great big huge apples is because you make them. So I'm a farmer's daughter, so I know about organic farming a lot because that's how I was brought up. You can get big apples if you thin the apples out when they start to form the little buds, and then you'll get big ones. Otherwise, you have to use a lot of chemicals to produce big apples, and that's why I'm against them, and probably intuitively that's why you're against them. But I can tell you at the moment I'm going nuts. So anyone who wants apples, I can give them to you.
Yeah, no, the same thing to me. I forgot to thin out the apple tree in our garden this summer, and we've got millions of small apples because I didn't thin them out. Yeah. And
they're very tasty. But
yeah, lovely. We've made.
What on earth am I going to do with them all? So we need to think. I've frozen some. I've made applesauce out of others. I've never done that before because I'm too busy, but I had to find the time, wee hours of the morning, kind of making applesauce. I think I'm nuts. And is it really worth it? How much am I spending in cooking it and my own time and energy? But my time and energy doesn't cost the earth. It's just the electricity that does. So I think a very complex question, and Steve was right to sort of say, this is it has to be a complex answer. But I think we have to start questioning everything, and we don't. And that's why I think climate change is going to be really difficult to reduce. But we're making a start, and that's important. And I think it's really important that we support each other, those of us who are interested in this and committed to making change, that we do that, because we need to talk to each other too. Otherwise, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you're making applesauce out of tiny British apples, you think, is this what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because actually food is a huge issue to do with the soil. When I read the literature and I read the latest technologies, there's a lot of excitement about being able to grow meat in labs. There's a lot of excitement about being able to produce food without soil, and potentially we'll be able to do that and it'll be nutrient rich. But what I always come back to in terms of championing soil health, not just for food security, is that the other functions that soil delivers will always be required. So the flood resilience and drought resilience, so that we don't lose our soil and our areas that hold our green spaces and our wildlife, particularly our biodiversity, are absolutely essential. And the exciting thing about the movement that has been going for a long time, but now big companies seem to be joining the regenerative agriculture movement and wanting to change, is that it's going to hopefully allow us to not use any more land, in fact, use more land sustainably, because we're very wasteful with our land and our use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and spending far too much money on that to the detriment of soil health. And if we can use more land sustainably, which again, this is not my area of expertise, but when I read people who do know about this sort of stuff, we can do that. We can feed 10 billion on the amount of land we've got and put more land aside for wildlife and biodiversity, which of course helps in the with things like COVID-19 and the fact that we've got pandemics because we're moving into those habitats. That's what we need to rebuild soil for, to make sure that we're optimizing the efficiency of our water use and our soil use for food growth, until we move potentially to systems where we don't need so much soil for food because we've got technologies.
Some more questions come in, Karen.
Yeah, I see, from Maggie. Thanks, Maggie Bossenquet from Durham County Council. Hi. Is there a lot of knowledge about how to maximize carbon storage in soils? I assume healthy soils store more carbon, but is it more complex than that? Hi, Maggie. Is there anything you want to add to that question? I didn't ask you, sorry, if you wanted to ask yourself. It would be great if you wanted to add.
Don't worry, you're welcome to speak for me. I'm not an expert on this subject, but obviously I work at the County Council. We're in charge of the climate emergency and low carbon and trying to reduce carbon emissions to net zero. And I'm really interested in carbon offsetting, not as the solution, but as something that we've got to do in addition to all the other work. And I've been interested for a long time to know whether there are particular ecosystems that we should be encouraging. Obviously, we're all planting trees. And in Durham, we're doing a lot to protect the peatlands, and we're looking at offshore waters as well now in the subsea bed. But is there work we should be doing about soils and carbon storage? Specifically?
Yeah, Neal, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, because obviously we can do things like plant forests, and that they are inherently higher organic matter in those soils compared to, say, arable. But I guess if we have arable soils, which we do need to feed ourselves, there are things that I think are afoot. Obviously, plants can pump carbon into soil, and the organic carbon that builds up is in itself, at least in a temporary sense, a store of carbon. But what's fascinating is the relationship between the breakdown of that organic matter, which is always constantly being cycled, and then ultimately its incorporation into the mineral content of the soil, for example, precipitation of carbonate. And it's interesting that we're working with people like David Manning, who are interested in using mineral additives to soils as a way of capturing carbon in arable soils. So you provide the minerals as nutrients, but you're also, the weathering of those minerals leads to the formation of carbonate, which are an even more permanent and larger store, potentially, of carbon capture.
Yeah, Wendy?
Yeah, Maggie, I just wanted to leap in there as well. Sorry, I've got an alarm going in the background. I'm just going to have to talk over it. So I think one of the things that we spoke a lot about is what Neal just mentioned is you've got the minerals. If you look at a lot of natural ecosystems, you've got biodiversity that really plays a role. So you'll see most of these are summarized in general agroecology. But I think what we were really interested in, and kind of it's the outflow of our work, is actually, so what we've got is we've got a mass of scientific information, and there are so many details to it. And what we're looking at next to really help, for instance, councils, and we're starting to implement this here in Cape Town, is this idea of a tool, almost like a matchmaking tool, to go, how do we reduce this down to what is it that a particular soil might need? How do we identify what a particular soil might need? And how do we identify the local sources of waste or sources of carbon that are easily accessible to help with local? I think they're going to talk about circular economy later. But I think reducing that complexity down to being able to identify what we have and what we need in terms of soil and waste would be a really interesting way of looking at that. And that really is the center of your question. What are those central parameters? And I think science can do a better job of kind of identifying those and making it accessible to the government, to strategists, to policymakers and farmers. They're all interested in that information.
I think so. And Maggie, thanks so much for your question, because I know that for many local authorities across the world, to achieve net zero, which many authorities, of course, have signed up to and countries have signed up to, soil has to be part of that. The science is the inorganic carbon, as Neal suggests, and the organic carbon, and how we keep those in the soil for as long as possible. But I think that the numbers out there, the quantification of that, are quite confusing, because it is very complicated, because we understand now that soil organic matter is a spectrum of materials that are basically, yes, you can divide it into, some is turned over within the year, months to years, and certainly in the global south, more like days to weeks, and where the temperatures are higher, in our sandy soils as well. But we have some types of carbon that are stored for longer, but it is a spectrum and it depends on that microbiome. So that's why we haven't got at the minute, very specific guidelines of put this in your soil and you will store X amount of carbon and you can offset by this much. And that is really frustrating, which is why as a community, what many of us are starting to think now is that we do need to get there, and we're trying to simplify it as exactly as Wendy says, but we won't be able to be very specific about how much carbon can be stored, because if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, the science isn't there yet in order to say that it will last for X years. But what we can say is that we can rebuild soil structure and hold on to more water. And we can, what we're exploring as well is the relationship between putting more carbon in the soil and above ground and below ground biodiversity. It's still a work in progress, basically, which is why I suppose I know that we work together putting in a suggestion that the government's Environmental Audit Committee look at net zero and soil particularly for local authorities, because we need some more policy guidance on this, that even if we can't reward a quantified amount of carbon that's being stored, because it's very difficult to measure that, at least we reward the practices, the land management systems that we know will increase carbon. So like, for example, the peat restoration, making sure the sphagnum is all there and we're not draining that land, or for a sandy soil, potentially adding some material which is a clay-sized particle and can hold on to the nutrients and the water better, allowing the microbiome to build soil structure to hold carbon. So it's more qualitative at the minute, the information that we're able to provide and that we're working on a framework for. I don't know if anybody else has got any other comments.
Just to pick up on, I really like the idea Wendy was saying, you know, that, Wendy, as I understand it, you're saying it's got to be done on a case-by-case basis. Each individual soil has its own needs. Yeah.
I think the idea is to try and find some sort of guideline that can be applied to particular cases. So yeah, some way to narrow it down.
Yeah.
Maggie, does that answer your question? Is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Because it's a really important topic. We've only got a couple of minutes left.
Well, thanks. I mean, I found that really, really interesting, and thanks to Joel for the paper, which I'll access in a minute. I'm just wondering if there's something we can do in Durham to try and do a bit of development work on some land somewhere. I mean, who knows? But perhaps that's a conversation for outside of here.
It maybe is, but it links into a project that involves, actually, because we've got a couple of colleagues who are both originally from Zimbabwe, the eco-school projects that, you know, Rich Hurst at Durham County Council is running. We're working with the kids there, and of course those kids are working with schools across the world, including schools in Zimbabwe. And, you know, again, obviously I'm pushing this a bit hard, but this looks like a simple jam jar full of soil, but this is a starting place for how to understand what minerals and organic matter we might add to different soil types across the region where we live, in order to understand. I mean, it's not a quick solution, but it's a way to sort of kill two birds with one stone, in a way, in terms of engaging people with soil and getting us discussing this, you know, and having a conversation. And then at the end of the day, we can analyze those results and see what form the carbon is. We can test to see how stable it is in those different amendments.
Interesting. I wonder if it's something we could do at an event sometime, get people involved.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about that offline. That would be great.
Yeah, I've got an idea on that. So yeah.
Can I then draw this conversation to a close and say thanks so much to the Durham Energy Institute for hosting us, to Lynn, thanks so much for all your support, and of course to our panelists, to Torreira, to Neal, to Steve and Wendy, and the guys who've asked us questions. Thanks so much, Lena, Maggie and Fiona, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Please come to the next session, which next week is actually at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. It's on soil health and biodiversity, and we've got Professor Diana Wall from Colorado State University joining myself and Wayne Dawson from biosciences, and also hopefully Neal and Steve and Wendy, you'll be welcome as well. So please look out for that. It's on the same advert that you saw this one. So thanks very much, and we'll bring this to a close.